Welcome to Rethinking Economics, a Henry George School podcast series. Rethinking Economics is all about questioning the core foundation of economics. This series questions economic orthodoxy to better understand the forces and shifts shaping our society and the world. Together, we'll interrogate things like the efficacy of economic models, if mainstream assumptions are always correct, and why the ideas and concepts you learn about in textbooks may lead you astray. Today's discussion was recorded in May of 2025 between our host, me, Nathan Greene, and our guest, Mr. Ketan Ahuja. Part of the reason why I wanted to start the Rethinking Economics series is that I think there are many aspects of economics, economic thinking, and economic institutions that need reforming. And one of the main areas where this reform needs to happen is antitrust. Antitrust has become a popular and, as of late, bipartisan issue. For those of you who are unaware, antitrust laws give the government the power to regulate, manage competition, prevent monopolies, and stop harm to consumers. Antitrust powers were first vested with the government with the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, when businesses first began to reach their quote-unquote giant status. After 1890, though, there were some pretty substantive reforms to antitrust power that at times strengthened the government's ability to intervene in the economy, and at others weakened it. Now, I'll let you, the listeners, determine whether you think the government has too much or too little power to intervene in markets. But what is undeniable is the growth of these gargantuan companies like Google and Amazon, while the gap between the rich and the impoverished widens. And I'm sure many of you listening think these two phenomena are inextricably linked. So, how can the state better shape markets and market structures to shrink this gap? My guest today helps us reimagine the goals of antitrust and how it can be used to form innovation ecosystems to the benefit of society. Mr. Ahuja is a lawyer, researcher, and political organizer. He initially began his career as an antitrust lawyer at Latham and Watkins, where he mainly worked on competition and market structure cases. After a brief stint working for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, Mr. Ahuja became a fellow with the Department of Energy, where he worked on reducing market barriers in solar energy. Mr. Ahuja is currently an affiliate of the University of Oxford and a fellow at Harvard University's Growth Lab, where he researches and teaches antitrust and green development. He has written numerous publications that have appeared in newspapers and journals such as the Financial Times, ProMarket, the Roosevelt Institute, and the Cambridge University Press. Mr. Ahuja earned his master's from Harvard in public policy and Oxford University in law, and is currently a PhD candidate at Oxford. I was lucky enough to join Mr. Ahuja in discussing his innovationist capabilities approach to antitrust, green industrial policy, and how the state is able to shape markets and go beyond simply correcting market failures. We hope you enjoy this talk, and please make sure to check back on our page every week for a brand new episode. Mr. Ketan Ahuja, thank you very much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Nathan.
So, I read your brief and I found it very enlightening. And of course, it talks about antitrust as well as industrial policy. But before we get into some of what you've written about, I just want to talk about the political environment. Right now, there seems to be a lot of bipartisan support for antitrust, both on the left from progressives like AOC and Elizabeth Warren, but also on the more hard right from people like J.D. Vance, who praised people like Lena Khan, the former FTC chair. So I'm curious. What caused this sudden bipartisan support for antitrust? What has changed in the past 10 or 20 years? Has the US economy become less innovative? Have consumers lost purchasing power? Has M&A activity increased significantly? Why the sudden interest in antitrust?
It's a great question, Nathan. I think we have seen tectonic shift taking place in slow motion over the last 20, 30 years or so in the economy. And nowadays, massive concentrations of wealth are possible beyond what even the robber barons in the Gilded Age could have ever dreamed of. Andrew Carnegie could have never dreamed of the sorts of wealth that Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos have managed to acquire. And yet, at the same time, ordinary people are struggling. No one can afford eggs or rent or health insurance these days. And the economy has become geared to benefit the very wealthy. And people have kind of put two and two together because it feels like everyone in America is trying to sell you something. You're always being upsold. Your airline asks you to pay a bit more to book a seat, and then to pay a bit more to bring your bag, and then to pay a bit more to board on time. And so everyone's just nickel and diming you, and people have no control against the companies that have the power to do this. And everything's expensive. And this relates to the economic research because plenty of studies have found that markups and concentration have been rising, and companies' profit share has been rising as well. And this is a long-running structural trend. So the economy is getting less competitive, and people have kind of realized that that relates to how they're facing economic hardships in their ordinary lives. And I think that's made antitrust this political hot button. There are a few times in American history where antitrust has really popped up, and I think now it's very relevant and salient to everyone because people have realized that they're getting fleeced by these massive corporations that have enormous power nowadays.
And I'm just curious, since we're talking about the politics of it, usually antitrust has been more of a kind of like liberal or progressive issue, but now it's being adopted by more conservative or libertarian politicians. Do you see the appeal of antitrust lasting within this more rightward circles, or is this a little bit more of a, I guess, political fad for now?
I think I think this left-right divide is not necessarily the right one to see antitrust through. I think antitrust is more about whether you're on the side of the big companies or on the side of everyday people. And you can see that in, for example, Teddy Roosevelt was a huge antitrust believer and spearheaded a huge amount of antitrust enforcement. And he did it from a very libertarian viewpoint on the economy. He believed in, the America of the American West, where cowboys and individuals could go out and make their way in the world. And they didn't have government on their backs, but they also didn't have these giant corporations that were blocking them at every turn. So I think you can see that in the statements that the current head of the FTC and the FTC commissioners and head of the DOJ have recently made, where they advocate for a conservative but pro-enforcement antitrust based on these more libertarian principles of being able to act freely in the economy.
No, it's just funny because when you say pro-enforcement and conservative, it just sounds like a bit of an oxymoron to me. And as somebody who does think it's time to begin wielding antitrust powers, I'm happy to see that it is a bipartisan issue. I hope it lasts. So I could not agree more with you on the fact that companies are starting to kind of nickel and dime people more. We see concentration increasing within industries. I think it is in part due to the Chicago school's influence on policymakers and those policymakers' anti-interventionist approach to the economy. This approach tends to be more market-oriented and is usually hesitant towards government intervention, which can range anywhere from fines to conduct changes to breakups or spinoffs. How do you think we should begin to change how we think about antitrust, and what about the process needs to change?
I think you pick on a really important trend, and the Chicago school and this neoliberal approach to antitrust had enormous impact in how antitrust was practiced. Nowadays, no one really believes in the Chicago school or neoliberal ideas around economics. No one thinks it's really an honest intellectual movement. It was really just anti-government ideology masquerading as academic advances. But it has left a huge impression on the structure and the norms of the antitrust profession. So one of the impacts it um, has been stabilizing antitrust around these more precise economic assessments of what helps and what harms consumers. And I think that's been really a very positive thing. But it's also led to this dominant modern view of antitrust, which people kind of conflate with these ideas about this consumer welfare standard. But this dominant modern view is really that general principles of economics can more or less determine rules of antitrust around how to structure markets well for society. And um, and people have kind of related that to the increasing concentration in the economy, and people have now been reaching back into antitrust history, casting around for alternative understandings of how to create antitrust policy in ways that benefit society. And so one of the historical views is now kind of, it was the dominant ideology of the Biden administration enforces, which is that antitrust is a broad instrument and it exists to protect democracy and fairness and fight inequality. And so it's just a broad instrument of economic policy. And I think the profession has been in this moment of confusion because, what's old isn't necessarily serving it anymore. And yet this historic viewpoint about antitrust as a broad policy instrument leads to something that's kind of unstable and not necessarily hugely precise or measurable in how it goes about enforcing. And I think that the lesson within that is that there are real problems, particularly with what you might call the dominant modern view, but also with this historical challenger view. And I think the dominant modern view really misunderstands what economics can tell us. It treats economics as determinative in some sense, as really providing general principles that then take away the discretion of the policymaker. And that's not at all what economics does. Economic models can make precise assessments of various things, but they're never determinative. They're really more informative. And you have to interpret them alongside value judgments and choices and policy discretion that people need to maintain. Otherwise, you end up just picking a particular model and adopting the values of that model as canon. But at the same time, the historical model for antitrust also doesn't fit the modern economy that well, because it becomes too unstable to pick all these various goals, and it's not necessarily clear how an antitrust action can advance a particular goal, um, and it doesn't take advantage of all the enormous learning that has gone on in economics faculties and other areas of academic research over the last 50 years that allow people to make quite precise, measurable assessments of lots of different aspects of market activity. So I think what we need to change about antitrust is we need to give some degree of discretion and value judgment back to the policymaker while still benefiting from the learnings of multiple different areas of economics in how to make good policy.
So, when making better policy, I think this is where some of your work for the Roosevelt Institute comes in, and some of your recent work has focused on how antitrust can promote innovation using this ecosystems or innovative ecosystems idea. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing it up. So the neoclassical economics, which is what's taught in, what you would think of as taught in economics faculties, tends to focus on problems in a particular way, and it tends to really focus on like the incentives of market actors. So it's really often the questions that neoclassical economists ask are around who has the incentives to take what sorts of activities, what sorts of actions. Um, and that's great, but it ignores many different features of what makes an economy vibrant. And, people's incentives drive action, but people's ability also drives action. And so many people, uh, and antitrust has not typically engaged in questions of ability with any richness. And that's because traditional economics doesn't have a rich language for questions of economic ability or capability. And that sort of research doesn't tend to happen that much in traditional economics faculties. But it does happen in many other departments within social sciences. So it happens in management studies and in network science and in studies of economic development and economic geography. And one thing that has one common learning from a lot of those disciplines has been that places have people need a set of capabilities to be able to innovate within a domain. So it doesn't matter if you may want to create a new vaccine, but it doesn't matter if you don't have access to any biotechnology facilities or biomedical engineers. And so you need an ecosystem that brings together all the right capabilities, which you can then recombine to make new innovations and support new companies and new products developing. And so antitrust has never really had a language for speaking about capabilities and ecosystems as they relate to innovation. But decisions in antitrust have had a very big impact on these underlying capabilities and ecosystems. So, antitrust may prevent a merger or require compulsory sharing of technology or do things that change the structure of the economy in ways that crowd people in or push people away from having the ability to innovate.
Just to make sure I understand this properly, it kind of sounds like you want to take a little bit of like a macro perspective to Amartya Sen's capabilities theory, where you're giving both individuals, but groups of people or smaller companies, let's say, the ability to innovate or just experiment to create this innovation and kind of democratize the ability to innovate as opposed to it being hoarded by one or two big players, say Google or Apple, something like that.
Absolutely, yeah, that's exactly right. And antitrust is a critical lever to make sure lots of different people have the ability to innovate. And in the end, that'll promote faster and more effective innovation on behalf of consumers and the overall economy.
So now let's say that we are buying into this innovation as a capabilities approach. How do we measure success? What kind of metrics or empirical indicators should we look to assess whether or not an ecosystem is healthy or distorted?
I think that's a really good question. So the the first point to make about an ecosystem is that you can't have an ecosystem of only a few players. An ecosystem is inherently about having lots of different companies and technologies interact. It's more about the connections between technologies or companies and entities rather than the companies themselves. So the thing that you're really interested in is these dynamic interactions, less so the kind of firm as a unit. And then, innovations, people who have studied technology will tell you that innovation happens because people or firms recombine existing technologies in new ways to make new things. So most new technologies new architectures of old technologies. The iPhone was some combination of an iPod and a cell phone. And so it's like taking the battery and the memory chips and the screen and then adding in the cellular communications infrastructure. So what you want to see is a place where there are lots of different interactions, and then you want to see that producing lots of new products and services that come along and potentially displace old services. Where one thing is being used in much the same way for a very long period of time, that suggests a lack of innovation. Exactly how you measure that depends on context. And there's a lot of work to be done to really figure out how to measure these things in the context of antitrust cases. But when you talk about the network of different technologies, you'd want a network that is dense, sophisticated, highly interacting, and there are various different network science measurements that you can use to assess that.
So I agree with you that we do need to move away from price theory, which can be a little bit static and narrowly focused. But at least I can kind of see why price theory would be beneficial when considering antitrust actions. I mean, at the end of the day, you don't want consumers to be paying higher prices or to be gouged in that sense. How does an innovationist capabilities approach kind of help consumers who are the ultimate beneficiaries of antitrust? Or should we just begin to think about it differently altogether and say maybe the consumer isn't necessarily what we should be focusing on?
Absolutely. So I think the price antitrust, as you rightly point out, that prices have taken a special place in antitrust litigation, and that's largely because they're easily measurable. There's nothing in economic theory that says consumer welfare is just prices. Economic theory would also say it's quality and innovation, and but prices are easy to measure. But we definitely don't want to fall into the trap of only seeing what we can measure easily in the world. And so consumers will definitely benefit from more innovation. I think innovation is has always been seen as a central objective of antitrust, and focusing on the amount and rate and quality of innovation is critical to driving consumer welfare. Um, and um, And I think you're right that consumers aren't necessarily the only objective of antitrust action. I think enabling more firms to compete vigorously is 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 something that antitrust has aspired to do for a long time. And and yeah, okay, in the long term that helps consumers and more innovation helps consumers too. But I think the key thing is that innovation is definitely going to help consumers, and it does so by empowering and this innovation ecosystems lens that I bring on the topic does so by empowering more firms to to innovate.
I do find the idea of the tech ecosystem or the innovation ecosystem one that's appealing, but I have had some experience kind of dealing with them or seeing their effect in real life. I was interviewing at one point with a few of these tech ecosystems. One was in Charlotte and one was in Cleveland, and these aren't exactly known as kind of hubs of innovation. There was a lot of resource and knowledge sharing that these organizations offered. In some cases, it was quite extensive and impressive, some of the programs they offered. But I talked to a lot of my colleagues who still work for those companies and in those areas, and they aren't exactly kind of seeing any groundbreaking innovations coming out of these places or these organizations. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that these cities and these organizations are making a concerted effort to create these tech ecosystems, but they haven't quite made a difference, at least yet. Does there need to be a balance between the incentives to innovate and the ability to innovate?
I think, yeah, absolutely. It's a critical point. So if you look at the geography of America, billion-dollar companies have come up largely, tech startups. They've come up mostly in Silicon Valley, some in New York, some in a few other places, but they've been very much focused on a few very small major cities. And that's because everyone in America has the same incentive to create a company. Everyone benefits equally by becoming a billionaire, but the but not everyone has the same ability, and that's because these different cities have differently capable enabling environments. So, places like Cleveland and Charlotte, once upon a time, Cleveland was a real hotbed of innovation. It
Yep.
was the place where you could create a new auto company, and it was leading in an industry of the future, and it had all the right people and capabilities to allow entrepreneurs in those areas to do amazing things. Now it's somewhat lot less capable than it used to be. It's less well connected and it doesn't have the same draw for talent or capital. So I think I think what you really point to is that there's a real role for government policy to build these enabling environments and create strong innovation ecosystems by giving everyone in these different places the ability to become entrepreneurs and commercialize great innovations. And that's partly an industrial policy question. More public investment
Hmm.
in technology and services, and it's partly a question of antitrust, creating the right economic structure for innovations to take off.
So, if I'm understanding or hearing you correctly, you're saying that there needs to be a little bit more policy support for these companies or for these ecosystems, either from state or federal government. If I'm understanding correctly, it sounds like maybe local government isn't able to offer that same level of support that the state or federal government would. But I do want to note that, and you mentioned this in your Bruegel piece, that in 2009, Governor Deval Patrick passed the Life Sciences Act, and now Boston is becoming a booming biotech hub. And so, can Cleveland and Charlotte do something similar, or should they try and get resources from state or federal governments?
I think the cities and the states can absolutely do a lot of what they need to do, and they shouldn't hesitate to take it into their own hands. I think the in each place exactly what it needs to build a thriving ecosystem will differ. Some places have lots of access to capital, but they don't have any customers in a specific industry. And some places have a whole lot of great technology research going on, but maybe none of the major companies in the area. And I think it's very important for places to figure out exactly what is constraining their ecosystem and then do the specific things that help in their context. So part of my work is at the Growth Lab at Harvard University, and they use this framework there, which they've developed for promoting and understanding economic development, which is called growth diagnostics, and that really aims to help places diagnose the constraints that are binding a form of growth in their area and then take action to really solve those constraints using strategic industrial policy at whatever level of government is most appropriate.
Well, as somebody who just finished up a degree in international development, that sounds fascinating, and I would love to learn more about that. So, just kind of going back to one of the points you previously touched upon, you said that vigorous competition is good, and you talked about the impact that can have on consumers and innovation. So, competition is good for innovation. There's no denying that. I won't argue that with you. You don't want one firm to establish a dominant position over another and kind of get away with them complacently cementing their position just for their mere size alone. But I do think it is undeniable in some cases that there does need to be kind of like a titan of industry that is capable of harnessing a vast amount of resources and creating innovations. I think innovation and continuing to expand economic growth become more expensive and harder to achieve the more technologically advanced a society becomes. And this is kind of why America first established industrial monopolies back in the 18th and 19th century, so we could begin to produce steel and cement needed to build roads and bridges and just basic building blocks of modern society. And then fast forward today, again, we see groundbreaking innovations coming from the United States in digital and now AI technologies, and they come from these behemoth of corporations like Google, Apple, and Meta. And I do think there is a little bit of an appeal to this idea of like the national champions of a country and having the biggest, brightest, and best technology companies working on the most groundbreaking innovations. I certainly don't like having monopolies or dominant companies, but I do think there is certainly something to say about their contributions to technological innovation. Can we have big companies without eroding innovative ecosystems? And is there a problem with bigness alone?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the it's a really intuitive idea that you need a large company to be able to make big investments in expensive new technologies. And We've seen some incredibly innovative large companies, Google and Apple. They're terrifically innovative, and AT&T was in its day. IBM has been in the past. Microsoft certainly is. But there are plenty of very large companies that don't do anything for innovation as well. Um, nowadays, Verizon and AT&T aren't seen as huge drivers of innovation in any really important technological domain. And I think what that points to is that there aren't actually hard and fast general rules. What matters is context. And so big companies, they have lots of assets that they can bring to innovation, but they also have lots of disadvantages. They have lots of great capital, lots of terrific engineers, but the incentive structure is all wrong for them to commercialize innovations. They tend to do things that support their mothership and avoid doing things that may create breakaway innovations that challenge them. And it's within a research team in a big company, your incentive isn't necessarily to commercialize what you're doing because your incentive is to keep your team manager happy and so we actually see a lot of big companies that develop interesting things but never bring them to market, either because they don't want to or because the incentives are wrong for them to, or just the organizational structure doesn't allow them to focus on any particular opportunity that's not their main one. So, for example, AT&T had Bell Labs. Bell Labs created many of the innovations that power the modern digital economy. For example, the semiconductor. But it wasn't able to commercialize really any of them. It was just a research lab, and it took spinning things out of Bell Labs and people leaving to go out and make something of these new technologies, ensure they had an impact on the world. There used to be this idea in management theory. So BCG was famous for coming up, the management consultants, they're famous for coming up with this idea that conglomerates have a specific growth model where businesses have like a cash cow business that is slow growing but very profitable and quite mature. And then they can take that money and reinvest it into new, creating new businesses. And the beauty of that model is that it does very well when capital is constrained. So if some random innovator can't go out to the capital markets and raise money for a new product, then you're reliant on looking at existing sources of funding, which are like profitable companies with the risk appetite to invest. But where you have well-developed capital markets, you actually don't need big companies to invest, and maybe you're better off without them. So that's like the US today, where you mentioned the big tech companies innovating in AI. Many would consider that them actually followers. And although Google developed a lot of the key technology in generative AI, it actually wasn't the first to commercialize it, and it's not leading right now. Um, it was OpenAI, which was at the time a scrappy outsider that commercialized it. And what enabled OpenAI to do that was that it had the right incentive structure. It was a smaller team that could operate more nimbly. But then critically, it was also able to raise capital. In Silicon Valley, you can raise billions of dollars for a good idea. And you're seeing that in lots of domains in AI right now, where the most innovative applications and use cases actually aren't coming from the big techs. The big tech companies are creating great base models and doing interesting things, but the most novel applications are actually coming from small startups that are able to raise capital. Now, in an environment where you didn't have deep capital markets and a rich funding infrastructure, I would agree with you. And I think that's the case in a lot of countries that aren't the US, where, it's just hard to raise money. You don't have people who will invest in someone they don't know. Then you need a company that you benefit from having a big company that can invest in innovation.
Now, it's interesting that you say that these like big tech companies are more of followers than they are kind of leaders or innovators. And it just reminds me of how Mark Zuckerberg really is not that innovative of a human being or an entrepreneur. I mean, some of the biggest or most popular products he has weren't his own idea. I mean, Facebook was created by the Winklevoss twins, and he, yes, coded it and created the platform for it, but he stole that idea from them. And then even something like the metaverse or the Oculus headset that they sell, he bought that company. He did not kind of build it or create it himself. And so now I think there's a lot of truth in that. The idea that tech companies are more of followers than they are leaders. So as you begin to see the development of AI, and you see a lot of these smaller companies trying to be innovative and produce these new and groundbreaking AI models, do you want to see a bit of more separation between the big tech companies and these AI startups? Just because we are beginning to see a lot of partnerships and investments from big tech into these smaller companies, and I'm assuming we'll try and, I guess, corner the market once they do have a more or a better product. So, do you want to see a little bit more separation between big tech and these new startups?
I think that's worrying me less than it did a year ago or so. We used to think that the model layer, the base model layer, would be very, very concentrated because these models are so capital intensive to train. You have to have billions of dollars of data center equipment to be a leading model developer. And so there are only going to be a few base models. That fortunately seems like it's less concentrated than we thought. So you have open source models that are very, very capable, like the one from DeepSeek and Facebook's Llama. So these are ones that anyone can use. And there are now plenty of good options to choose from. A lot of the interesting, a lot of the interesting work is coming around on more the application layer. So there are lots of startups that are creating new applications that harness these models and make them useful for specific purposes. And that's very distributed. Those are kind of appearing all over the place, and lots of small companies are coming up with lots of great new ideas. And I think the critical thing that we have to do is prevent that application layer from consolidating. So historically, antitrust has been less critical of what you might call vertical or conglomerate market relationships than horizontal market relationships. So, like a horizontal market relationship is where one company directly competes with another and they create a product that can substitute for each other's product, and they're selling to the same group of customers. Vertical relationship or conglomerate relationships are where companies are maybe suppliers or customers of another company and they don't directly compete. And in the past, we've thought that means they're probably okay from an antitrust perspective, because it means that you're not going to be lessening competition in any individual market or horizontal market anyway. And maybe there are even synergies where it's beneficial to allow companies to combine if they're not in the exact same market, because then they can leverage each other's technology or avoid duplicating costs or whatever. And I think our experience in big tech, with today's dominant big tech platforms, is that it was actually a mistake to be permissive of those sorts of vertical or conglomerate integrations. Because what these vertical mergers do is they allow companies to build enough power within an ecosystem that they can then take control over the ecosystem as a whole. So, maybe they can, and that's what this recent Google ad tech case was about, where Google bought a bunch of different technologies within the ad tech stack, and that meant that Google could then monopolize the whole sector. And now the government's trying to force Google to sell off those different technologies, which it initially acquired. It didn't develop itself, even though at the time they didn't seem that problematic because they weren't kind of horizontal competitors to Google's offering.
If you could advise the judge who's ruling on this Google ad tech case right now, what would you try and say to him as to what they should be looking at or some things they should be considering before they make their decision?
I think the judge should really consider how to ensure that, I think from an innovation perspective, it's very important to consider how does everyone in the market have access to the important technologies or capabilities they need to innovate. And and then I think they need to really think about how Google can tie different products together. And I think the judge's opinion in that case was very, very good. And it does suggest structural remedies, forcing Google to sell off
I,
these
I
ad
was
tech.
about to ask, what if you were Judge Ahuja, what would you kind of rule and what would your remedy or what would your decision be?
I'm not gonna assume I have access to all the information that the current judge does, but
Of
based
course.
on based on the opinion and the public information, it it seems like reasonable ask for the government to ask for divestiture of these bits of the ad tech platform that Google initially acquired, didn't even build it itself. So I think structural remedies involving selling off these different parts of Google's ad tech ecosystem would be the right way to go.
And if I may just be devil's advocate here for a little bit,
Mm.
I know somebody who's in opposition to that is going to say, oh, if you break up Google or you try and enact these structural remedies, it's just going to make advertising more expensive. It's going to worsen the quality, which means it's going to kind of push inferior products on consumers. What your response to the opponents of that solution would be.
I think the clear evidence, at least from the public opinion in the case, is that Google used its power in ad tech to increase prices and lower quality for advertisers. So it ended up charging advertisers more than it would have, and reducing the information that advertisers can have access to on measuring the effectiveness of what they're doing. And Google also used its power to stamp out innovations in ad tech that advertisers came up with to try and improve their position as against Google. One innovation was called header bidding, which allowed advertisers to which allowed places that were selling ads to sell to different markets other than Google on web pages. And Google used its power to circumvent that. And so I think all the evidence in the case suggests that the opposite would happen, that by creating structural separations between these different layers of the ad tech world, that would increase competition and improve prices and innovation for ad tech customers.
Well, as a proponent of breakups and structural remedies, I am fully on board with you. Moving away from antitrust now and focusing a little bit more on industrial policy, one theme that you picked up on in your chapter in Bruegel is this idea of the state's power not just to kind of fix markets or market failures, but to create and shape markets. It reminded me a lot of Mariana Mazzucato's argument in The Entrepreneurial State and what gives the state the ability or kind of like the power to shape markets. How should states use their market making power in an innovation as capabilities approach? And are there any kind of specific industries or sectors that you had in mind in terms of focusing on?
Mm. This is actually a very old idea in America. So the Abraham Lincoln was known for this idea that the state, he believed that the state should do everything that people can't do themselves to better their own condition. As much as the people of a town can be great entrepreneurs, they can't necessarily coordinate among lots of different places or raise the capital to dredge a canal that would allow them to ship their goods out and be connected to other places. And so America has developed because the American government has been willing to solve these coordination problems and through public investment and efforts to shape markets, has been able to build a supportive environment, different 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 businesses to take off. And fixing market failures isn't necessarily about a technical fix with a specific policy instrument and giving the benefit of some kind of free market the benefit of the doubt that it's probably, going to be efficient. There is no, every market is a result of rules and regulations and investments that the state has made to create a space where people can come together and trade their goods and develop new services and innovate. So I think it's really an inherent critical power that the state has always had to create markets and, as Abraham Lincoln said, solve problems that people couldn't solve on their own. I think most states nowadays, they want to be in the critical, fast-growing industries that are going to position their economies well for the next 20 years. And that has often meant getting into green technologies, getting into, China's put a huge amount of investment into getting into things like EVs and batteries and wind turbines and solar panels, not because it particularly cares about the environment, but because these are the technologies of the future. They're cheaper and more efficient and less polluting, and everyone wants them. And so China can make a lot of money by selling them to the world. And so I think nowadays the state needs to use its power to get into these appealing, fast-growing industries that are good fits for what the state can already do.
And chapter in Bruegel, you mentioned there's kind of different rationales or appeals to industrial policy. One might be national security, one might be trying to commercialize a nascent industry. In terms of green industrial policy, which rationale would you evoke to try and persuade policymakers of its utility?
Mm. I think it it really depends on the context. I think one of the biggest problems in industrial policy is people tend to take this one size fits all approach to policy development. And in some cases, countries need to be really worried about national security. I think that's obviously the case in the US at the moment, where so many of our critical imports come from China, which is a strategic competitor. And that really limits our foreign policy flexibility because we can't do things that would lead to those resources being cut off. But then some places really want to kind of focus on the opportunity, the economic opportunity. And for places that want to do that, the industries that they're going to focus on will be different. So an industry, a country like America has the ability to do things that are adjacent to its existing industrial base. So, if you can make gas turbines, you're likely to be able to make wind turbines because they're kind of a similar mechanism, and a lot of what you have can be repurposed into wind turbines. But maybe you're less likely to be able to make solar panels. Whereas if you're a place like Taiwan, you have a semiconductor industry that's very capable and a lot of the best silicon engineers, then maybe you can make solar panels a bit easier. And so the opportunities a place has are really going to depend on its existing industrial structure and exactly what makes sense for its economy.
My final question, or I guess I should say penultimate question, gets at the theme of both of your pieces that I read, and it's that we need to kind of change how we think of economics, or we need to change our economic thinking when it comes to antitrust and industrial policy. So I was recently watching this great interview with Pete Buttigieg on Andrew Schultz's show. He's a comedian, but Pete starts talking about the iPhone, and he kind of starts talking about the Mariana Mazzucato argument of the iPhone was not assembled by the federal government, but a lot of the products and components that went into it were funded and researched by the government. And so he jokes that, if you had the federal government trying to produce an iPhone, it would probably come out to a not a very good product. I'll put it that way. You clearly desire the state to play a more active role in kind of like the day-to-day lives and the shaping of markets. So how should we begin to think about this new role for the state? Is it kind of keeping with that idea of the invisible hand guiding the economy, or is it something a little less subtle?
I think the people talk a bit about this idea of market crafting, where the state needs to do what it makes sense to be done. The state needs to do what needs to be done in different sectors. And sometimes that's creating the right enabling environment. You talked about Cleveland needing to invest more so that its technology startups can access capital and they can compete with companies that spring up on the coasts. And sometimes the state has a role to play in arranging that sort of investment. Sometimes the state needs to get out of the way. We have we have a big problem in this country where regulations and permitting mean that it's very slow to deploy energy infrastructure. And the state really needs to get out of the way of those processes and try and streamline them and, make sure things are safe and done correctly, but also avoid slowing them down. Um, and so I think I like Mariana Mazzucato's entrepreneurial state. I think something that's shaping markets, entrepreneurial, flexible, doesn't necessarily constrain its role in any sort of ideological way, but really is able and willing to do what needs to be done to solve problems.
No, I think that's a great way to look at it, as a state with multifaceted powers, but is not all-encompassing. So, my final question that I like to ask all of my guests who come on to the podcast is, if there is one thing about the world that you could change, what would it be and why?
I think people uh this is I am proud and happy to live in America, and I think this is shaped by my experience in America, but I think it's a worldwide phenomenon that I think people getting more disconnected from each other. And we we're struggling in that we're finding smaller and smaller spaces and fewer opportunities to really be able to talk to and understand each other. And I think it's creating uh, real malaise in people. It's creating a spiritual vacancy that's having all sorts of bad effects on our personal lives and in our politics and in our overall ability to be happy and lead satisfying existences. So I think I would love to find a way for people to uh, come together. I think we have to find a way for people to be able to talk to each other again.
No, I'm certainly in agreement with you there. I have a 15-year-old brother and he's like every other teenager sucked into his phone and it's hard to have a conversation with him while eating dinner and it's just hard to connect with somebody who I'm related to. And so yeah, I could not agree with you more. Mr. Ketan Ahuja, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast today. It was a pleasure having you.
Thanks so much, Nathan. Great to speak with you.
And that's it for this week's episode of the Henry George School podcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope it made you think. If you'd like to learn more about our research and policy tools, check out hgsss.org. That's hgsss.org. If you'd like to listen to our content as soon as it's published, subscribe to our show. If you like the show, please leave us a rating, review, or even share it with a friend. It goes a long way. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.